Just a few seconds after takeoff from St. Louis Airport in Missouri, a fire suddenly started in the engine of American Airlines DC-9-82 plane. As soon as they looked, various warning messages started sounding in the cockpit, and before the pilots could understand anything, the plane began to lose control rapidly. One by one, all the instruments on the cockpit panel started to shut down, and the plane began to descend rapidly. At an altitude of 1,500 feet in the sky, the lives of 143 people were at risk. Did the pilot manage to safely land the plane, or did this become the last journey for all 143 people? Today's case study is about the same dangerous incident of American Airlines Flight 1400. On the afternoon of September 28, 2007, 138 passengers and 5 crew members boarded American Airlines' MD-82 plane at Missouri's St. Louis Airport. This plane was scheduled to complete a flight of approximately 1 hour to reach Chicago. Apart from light and scattered clouds, it was a normal sunny day with a temperature of 30 degrees, which is typically considered perfect weather for any plane's flight. One by one, all the passengers slowly boarded the plane, but no one had any idea that this seemingly normal flight for the day could turn out to be so dangerous for everyone on board. Along with the flight crew, perhaps none of the passengers had thought that a combination of technical and human errors could bring such a significant challenge for all. The 59-year-old captain had been working with American Airlines for the past 17 years. For the last 4 years, he had been assigned as the first officer on a Boeing 777, and just 6 months before his retirement, he had started working as a captain on the MD-82. With 14,000 hours of flying experience, he was an experienced and seasoned pilot, with 6,000 of those hours in the role of captain. He began his flying career in 1970 as a fighter pilot in the American Air Force, and has since been recognized as an experienced pilot due to his impeccable flying career. Sitting in the cockpit's captain's seat was a 43-year-old first officer who had joined American Airlines in 1999. Before joining American Airlines, he had also worked as a pilot in the American Air Force and National Guard. Throughout his career, the first officer had accumulated 7,000 hours of flying experience, with 2,000 hours specifically on DC-9-82 planes. In total, the first officer was also an experienced and skilled pilot, much like the captain. The problems for Flight 1400 began when, despite multiple attempts by the pilot, the left side engine wouldn't start. Subsequently, the pilot requested ground staff to manually start the engine under such circumstances. To manually start the engine, ground staff had to use a special wrench tool to open the start valve and then press a start button by hand. This method was in line with Boeing's manual procedures for manually starting the engine. However, using the wrench tool to open the valve was time-consuming, and in their haste, the American Airlines ground staff would sometimes bypass this step and simply press the start button with a screwdriver to manually start the engine. And on that day as well, they did the same. After several attempts, the engine finally started, but perhaps no one realized how much trouble this makeshift solution, done to save a little time, would cause. Around 1:05 p.m., after all 143 passengers and crew members had boarded, the pilot initiated the roll-off process from the airport gate. While taxiing on the runway, both pilots were casually adjusting the plane's instrument settings according to the takeoff checklist, engaging in light conversation with each other as they proceeded forward. The time before takeoff is indeed critical for any flight and its pilots. During this period, pilots must exercise extreme caution while diligently following the takeoff checklist, ensuring that various settings and instrument panels are carefully attended to. In such circumstances, pilots are not allowed to make any mistakes. According to FAA rules, during takeoff, Until a plane reaches a safe altitude of 10,000 feet, pilots in the cockpit are not permitted to engage in any form of personal conversation. They must solely focus on the plane's settings and other matters related to takeoff. In this manner, amid light conversation, around 1:10 p.m., the plane reaches the starting point of the runway. With both engines at full thrust power, the captain initiates the takeoff roll on the runway. However, as the captain increases engine thrust, the left engine's start valve opens due to the rapid pressure buildup. Because of repeated attempts to manually start the engine by pressing the switch with a screwdriver, the start valve switch had become damaged. Therefore, when the engine thrust increased rapidly, the valve opened. Gradually picking up speed, the plane was now accelerating rapidly down the runway. After the start valve opened, the high-pressure air caused the starting turbine of the left engine to spin rapidly. Unaware of the severe issue in the left engine, the pilot proceeds with the takeoff. However, as the plane reaches an altitude of 1,500 feet, the rapid spinning of the starter turbine, caused by the high-pressure air outside the engine, makes it extremely hot, leading to a fire within the engine. The fire in the starter turbine quickly spreads to the engine. As soon as the fire warning alarm goes off in the cockpit, upon seeing the fire warning, the first officer immediately contacts the ATC tower for permission to make an emergency landing back at St. Louis Airport. The captain takes control of the plane and instructs the first officer to take action according to the fire checklist. Although both the captain and first officer had practiced with fire simulators multiple times during their training, as is often the case, real emergencies can bring panic and the tendency to forget some of the training details in the heat of the moment. According to Boeing's engine fire manual, the pilot must first follow 3 important steps, in which the first step is to disconnect the auto throttle mode, the second step is to set the engine thrusts to idle, and the third step is to cut off the fuel supply. And the fourth step is to activate the fire extinguisher in the engine. Following the checklist, the first officer completes the first and second steps. However, before completing the third and fourth steps, the first officer is able to shut off the fuel supply to the engine and activate the fire extinguisher. Meanwhile, the captain hands control of the plane over to the first officer and begins informing the cabin crew about the fire so that they can prepare the passengers for an emergency landing. In the midst of errors happening before landing, there was another significant mistake. As the plane had taken off just a few seconds ago, and all passengers were seated safely with their seatbelts fastened, it wasn't absolutely necessary to inform the cabin crew about the fire at that moment. During this crucial time when the first officer's entire focus should have been on the fire checklist, he was still controlling the plane. Typically, all these procedures, including what each person should do during emergencies, are discussed by the pilots before takeoff. This is to ensure that if a real emergency occurs, they won't be confused. That's why any form of personal communication among the pilots is discouraged in the cockpit before takeoff, so they can practice the emergency checklist diligently. Now, since both pilots were already engaged in a personal conversation in the cockpit before takeoff, perhaps this is why they couldn't follow the fire checklist correctly. In such a critical moment where every second counts and the pilot needs to make quick decisions, it took approximately 2 minutes after the engine caught fire for the captain to regain control of the plane, and the first officer to start reading the fire checklist again. But by then, a lot of time had already passed. Due to the fire in the left engine, many electronic equipment and cockpit control panels had shut down. The navigation panel in the cockpit had gone offline, so the captain was now using a mechanical backup navigation panel to control the plane's altitude and direction. With the left engine completely offline, the right engine was producing extra thrust, causing the plane to shake vigorously. In such a situation, where both pilots were struggling with instrument panel failures, controlling the plane was becoming very difficult. The captain was continuously trying to control the plane using the radar panel. While following the fire checklist for the second time, the first officer shut off the fuel supply to the left engine. Before he could proceed with the fourth step of turning on the fire extinguisher, an issue with the electrical systems suddenly caused the cockpit door to open. The first officer tried to get up from his seat and close the cockpit door, attempting several times before finally managing to close it. Afterward, he resumed following the fire checklist. And finally, about 3 minutes after the fire started in the engine, the fire extinguisher for the engine automatically turned on, successfully controlling the fire in the left engine. ATC tower instructs the captain to turn the plane towards the 250-degree direction and land on runway 30 right. While struggling to control the plane, the captain turns on the APU unit to provide a power supply to essential electronic equipment that might have been affected due to the left engine being shut down. Unfortunately, due to the severe fire in the left engine, the APU unit is also extensively damaged, and despite the pilot's repeated efforts, it cannot be started. A series of difficulties continued to unfold in the aircraft, and the lives of the 143 people on board were now relying solely on the two pilots. The airport was now about 6 miles away, and the captain was continuously controlling the plane towards the runway. Meanwhile, the first officer was managing the flap position and engine thrust. Recognizing the severity of the situation, the Air Traffic Control, ATC, had already deployed all emergency services at the airport. When Flight 1400 was just 3 miles from the runway, the first officer lowered the landing gear. However, a significant issue confronted the pilots at this moment. Even after lowering the landing gear knob, the landing gear indicator light did not turn on. This meant that the landing gear couldn't be confirmed as down. Given the electrical panel and equipment failures due to the left engine failure, the pilots suspected that the landing gear might have actually deployed, but the landing gear indicator light failed to turn on due to a system malfunction. Therefore, the pilot contacted ATC and requested them to visually confirm from the ATC tower whether the landing gear was down or not. ATC attempted to use binoculars to check, and they discovered that only the main landing gear was down, while the nose landing gear was still not down. They immediately relayed this information to the pilots. Due to the heavy weight of the plane with full fuel and 143 passengers on board, landing it without the nose landing gear would have been extremely risky and could have resulted in a disaster. However, just seconds before the landing, when the plane was so close to the runway and descending, the pilots were finding it nearly impossible to initiate a go-around and pull the plane back up. After the left engine failed, the right engine was operating at full thrust, and the captain was concerned that if the right engine continued to operate at full thrust like this, it might also fail due to the high pressure. For the captain, it was a situation where on one side there was a ditch, and on the other side there was a pit. In the cockpits, one by one, all systems were gradually shutting down. Finally, the captain decided that he couldn't risk landing the plane without the nose gear, so he chose to go around instead. With God in mind, the captain increased the thrust of the right engine to the maximum and pulled the plane up again without attempting a landing. Due to the main landing gear being down and the heavy weight of the plane, there was a lot of drag force acting on the plane, making it very challenging to climb back up. With great difficulty, the captain was maintaining the plane's speed with the help of full power from the right engine. As the plane gained some altitude, the captain informed ATC that they couldn't keep the plane in the air for much longer. Therefore, without wasting any time, they needed to make a small turn and land the plane as soon as possible. The captain was afraid that due to the continuously decreasing airspeed, the plane could potentially stall and crash at any moment. ATC immediately instructed the captain to land on runway 30 left. Checking so many warning signals coming into the cockpit and continuously controlling the plane's airspeed, direction, and other settings was becoming nearly impossible for both pilots. That's why they called an off-duty pilot traveling in the passenger cabin to the cockpit to help them. Despite major difficulties, Flight 1400 aligned itself with runway 30 left for another landing attempt. The captain knew this was their last chance to land the plane, and if they failed again, it would certainly result in a crash. Just a few minutes before landing, the first officer made one last attempt to manually extend the nose landing gear by pressing the emergency landing panel. It could be called a miracle that this time, the nose landing gear finally came down. The ATC controller also informed the pilot that they could see that the landing gear was down. And descending rapidly, the plane finally touches down on runway 30 left. Upon touching the runway, the captain immediately applies the manual brakes. The plane continues to run along the runway before eventually coming to a stop on the side. As soon as the plane safely stops, all the passengers cheer, hug each other, and thank God. Swinging between life and death, Flight 1400 landed safely, and by God's grace, no passenger or crew member was harmed in any way. But now, the biggest question was, why did something like this happen, putting the lives of 143 people at stake? The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, immediately began investigating this incident. In their investigation, the NTSB exposed many flaws in the plane maintenance process carried out by the American Airlines. They discovered that even before takeoff, the left engine had a damaged air filter, which was the reason the engine couldn't start due to airflow obstruction. The negligence of the American Airlines maintenance team was to blame for this major oversight. Instead of properly inspecting the engine and replacing the faulty air filter, they mistakenly used a screwdriver to start the engine, which led to a fire after takeoff. Furthermore, the way in which the captain and the first officer were unable to properly follow the fire checklist in an emergency situation, leading to such a dangerous scenario, raised questions about American Airlines' pilot training process as well. If you liked our video, please encourage us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. We are really grateful to you for your kind cooperation. Thanks a lot.